He found her dying in the desert whip marks, fresh on her back, wrists still bound, left for dead by her own people. He knew saving her could cost him everything. The Apache had already warned him to stay out of it. But when he cut those bindings and threw her across his horse, he made a choice that would turn his quiet, lonely ranch into a battlefield. If this story hit home, hit subscribe. More Wild West tales coming your way, stories about courage, survival, and standing your ground. Elias Ward pulled hard on the reins when he spotted something ahead, a body lying motionless in the red dust. It was a woman, tall, Apache. Her muscular frame was caked in dirt and dried blood. Purple welts from a whip ran across her shoulders and back, and her wrists were still bound with a strip of leather. Someone had tied her up and left her here. Her breathing was shallow. Her chest rose and fell in slow, uncertain rhythms. Elias jumped down from his saddle and knelt beside her. The ground beneath him radiated heat in shimmering waves. But colder than that was the thought running through his mind. This could be a trap. The Apache had warned him more than once to stay out of their business. He pressed his hand to her neck. Her pulse was so faint, he could barely feel it. If he left her here, the sun would finish her off in a few hours. He gritted his teeth, pulled the knife from his belt, and sliced through the leather bindings. Then he hoisted her over his shoulder. She was heavy, like lifting a full sack of grain, but he pushed through it and draped her across the back of his horse. Damit, he muttered under his breath. He kicked the horse into motion. Red dust swirled in its wake. The air smelled of blood, sweat, and scorched earth. Elias didn't look back. If anyone was watching, they'd know whose side he'd chosen. And this time, there would be no going back. Elias rode hard through the rickety wooden gate and into his homestead. He carried the woman inside the cabin and laid her gently on an old blanket beside the fireplace. Then he hurried to start a fire. Flickering yellow light danced across his sun-darkened, sweat-soaked face. He dragged over the wooden bucket and scooped what little water remained in the tank. Every drop of water during the dry season was precious, but he soaked a cloth and wiped the dust and dried blood from her face. Her pulse was still faint, but at least she was alive. Elias had never been one to get tangled in other people's problems. A few years back, disease had swept through this land and taken his wife and 2 young sons. Since then, he'd lived like a ghost, tending only to his parched land and a small herd of cattle. He stayed away from town, even farther away from trouble, but what he'd done tonight shattered all of that. The woman lying before him, Takina, was unlike the Apache women he'd seen before. Her body was powerful, with thick arms and broad shoulders like a warrior. The whip marks on her back told of a brutal punishment, likely for breaking tribal law. Elias knew one thing for certain. If the tribe found out he'd taken her in, they'd brand him an enemy. Outside, night was falling fast. Prairie winds swept sand through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying with them the lingering heat of the day. Elias tossed more wood into the fire and sat down beside Takina. The flames lit up his weathered, sun-scorched face and the gray eyes that were cold but deep. He handed her the last bit of water in a small bowl. She parted her lips, drank slowly, and then slipped into unconsciousness. Elias let out a heavy breath and pulled the rifle close, resting it within arm's reach. He leaned back against the wooden wall, eyes fixed on the door. He knew exactly what kind of people would leave a woman to die in the desert, and he knew they might return to finish what they'd started. If they did, Elias Ward would be the one standing in the doorway. The fire in the hearth had faded to glowing embers. Elias dozed in his chair, the rifle resting across his lap. A faint rustling sound snapped him awake. Takina. She pushed herself upright, her dark eyes wide and wild with panic. In an instant, her hand shot out and grabbed the small knife from beside the stove. Steel flashed in the firelight. Elias didn't move. He slowly raised both hands, his voice low and gravelly. If you're going to stab me, do it clean. But if you want to live, put the knife down. Takina was breathing hard, sweat beading on her forehead. Her eyes darted around the cabin, small, old, but not a prison. Then to the man in front of her, tall, lean, unshaven, eyes that were steady and cold. She hesitated. Elias kept his voice calm. I cut your bonds. If you want to leave, that door's open. But out there's nothing but hot sand and vultures. The knife trembled in her grip. After a long pause, she let out a breath and dropped it to the floor. Her powerful body sagged like a felled tree. Elias stepped forward, picked up the blade, and handed her the last bowl of water. Drink. You need it more than I do. Takina took the bowl and drank in slow sips, her eyes never leaving Elias. She looked like she was trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap without another word. Elias stepped out onto the porch and sat on the edge of the steps, his rifle across his lap. Takina tilted her head, watching through the door. In the moonlight, the man's silhouette remained still as stone. The only movement was the faint wisps of smoke curling from his cigarette. That entire night, Takina did not sleep. Each time the nightmares came, she opened her eyes and saw Elias still there, never coming in, but never leaving either. A strange feeling began to stir in her chest. Something she thought had died with her past. Safety. By the time the sky began to pale, Elias still hadn't moved. He simply turned his head and spoke quietly. If you want to stay until you're strong again, you can. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. The choice is yours. Takina stared at him. Then she turned her face away. She said nothing, but her hand tightened around the blanket draped over her shoulders. And that was her answer. The sun rose, casting its light down on the weathered roof of the cabin. Takina could stand on her own now. She stepped out into the yard, her shoulders still roughly bandaged, but her gaze sharp and focused. Elias was fixing a broken section of fence. He didn't bother to look up. You're stronger, he said in an even tone. If you want to eat, there's a spot to haul water behind the cattle pen. Takina said nothing, but a moment later, she picked up a wooden bucket and made her way to the water tank. Her thick, muscular arms flexed beneath sun-darkened skin as she pulled up the bucket. Elias glanced over. Someone who had nearly died just the night before was already strong enough to work. It caught him by surprise. That day, Takina said almost nothing. She simply followed Elias in silence, watching how he patched the fence and mixed mud to repair the walls. As the afternoon faded and Elias finally paused to rest, she suddenly stepped forward, picked up the hammer, and finished driving in the last posts. Elias stood still for a moment, then gave a quiet nod and let her carry on. That evening, for the first time, Takina lit the kitchen fire without being asked. She cooked a simple rabbit stew and set it down in front of Elias without a word. He looked at the bowl, then at her. A silent nod was all the thanks he gave. In the days that followed, the cabin was no longer so quiet. The sound of hammers, shovels, and wood clashing together filled the air. Elias dug a new water hole. Takina hauled stones to block the wind. Her strength was so great, she rebuilt an entire section of the fence in just one afternoon. One evening, as the sunlight faded, the two of them sat on the front porch. Elias lit a cigarette. Takina whittled a small piece of wood with her knife. For the first time, she spoke. "Why did you save me?" Elias stared out at the cracked, dry fields. "Because I couldn't bear to see someone left out there. I've seen too much death." Takina was silent. After a moment, she nodded, a simple answer. But something inside her seemed to uncoil and loosen. That night, as the wind rustled through the old roof, Takina no longer tossed and turned. For the first time in months, she slept deeply. Outside the cabin, Elias's slow, steady footsteps circled the homestead. "Thank you for being here. If this story reminded you of dusty sunsets and the echo of hooves pounding in your heart, go ahead and subscribe to my channel so that each day we can sit together once more. And I'll tell you another story from the Wild West. That afternoon, the sky suddenly turned a harsh golden hue. Elias was tightening the reins on his old horse when the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. His head snapped up. On the horizon, a faint trail of dust was growing larger. Uninvited guests. Elias Ward, grabbing the Winchester propped up on the porch, Takina heard the sound and stepped outside. The moment she saw the riders, she froze. 3 Apache warriors on horseback blocked the entrance to the ranch. Their faces were painted for war. Their eyes were cold as ice. The one in front nudged his horse forward and spoke in a deep, flat voice. "Our woman is here." Henhewa. Takina took a step back, her hand instinctively gripping the small knife at her side. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between the cabin door and the riders. The rifle was steady in his hands. "She's injured. She has the right to stay here until she's healed." Another warrior snarled, his voice rising. "She's been cast out by the tribe. She has no right to live on this land. If you shelter her, you become our enemy." Elias didn't lower his gun. His gray eyes were cold steel. "If you want to kill someone, you'll have to go through me first." The silence that followed was taut as a drawn bow. The wind kicked up, red dust swirling around the horse's hooves. From behind Elias, Takina stared at him. His face was calm, but his shoulders were tense, ready to fire at the first wrong move. Finally, the lead warrior lowered his spear, his gaze burning with fury. "We will return. Next time, we won't come alone." They yanked the reins and galloped off, leaving behind a trail of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence in the yard. Takina gripped her knife so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Elias turned back toward her, the fire still flickering in his eyes. "They'll come back with more," he said quietly, "if you still want to stay. We have to prepare." Takina nodded. Her eyes were now lit with a different kind of fire, not fear, but the burning will to survive. That night, Elias lit the lantern and dragged out every round of ammunition and every old sandbag from the shed. Takina stood beside him, sleeves rolled up, helping him barricade the windows and build up defenses in the yard. For the first time since she'd come here, she was no longer just a refugee. She had chosen to stand with him for the battle to come. 3 days later, before the sun had fully set, red dust began to rise on the horizon. Elias stood on the porch, his Winchester in hand. Takina had tied her hair back, gripping a spear and a knife. Her stance was that of a warrior ready for battle. The sound of hooves grew louder until nearly 20 Apache riders swept in, surrounding the ranch in a tight circle. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat and tanned leather. The warriors remained silent. Save for the heavy snorts of their horses, an elder stepped forward. He was old, with long silver hair and a deerskin cloak draped over his shoulders. His face was as stern as stone. He looked at Elias, then at Takina standing tall behind him. She was cast out. She belongs to the dust. Why do you keep her? Elias didn't lower his rifle. Because she's still alive, and she has the right to choose. A murmur rippled through the circle. A young warrior shouted, "She dishonored the tribe. She cannot be allowed to live." Takina stepped forward, her voice thunderous. "I dishonored no one. I was punished for not bearing children. But that is no crime." Silence spread like a wave. The warriors looked at one another, though the fire in their eyes still burned. The elder turned his gaze to Takina. "You choose to live here, under the roof of a white man. That means you sever all ties to the tribe." Takina gripped the shaft of her spear and nodded. "I choose life here." The elder was quiet for a long moment. Then he raised his hand. "We will leave tonight, but at dawn, I will return with the Council of Elders. If you are still here by then, you will no longer be a daughter of the tribe." He turned to Elias. "And you will bear the consequences." He turned his horse, and the entire war party followed, their hooves thundering as red dust swirled over the fence line. Once they had vanished from sight, Elias lowered his rifle. Takina still stood tall, her chest rising and falling with every breath. Elias looked at her, his voice low. "By morning, everything will change. Are you sure?" Takina met his eyes, her gaze burning with fire. "I already died once out there. I won't die again." Elias nodded, tightening his grip on the rifle. The night ahead would be long, and when the sun rose, this ranch might become a battlefield. At dawn the next morning, the sky turned a deep burnished bronze. Elias had been awake long before the rooster crowed. He stood on the porch, rifle fully loaded. Inside, Takina was tightening the bandage on her shoulder, her eyes sharp and cold as steel. A horn sounded in the distance, low and thunderous, like a storm. Then the riders appeared. Not just a small group this time, but the full council of elders and their escort. At least 50 people surrounded the ranch in a solid circle. A path opened before the gate. The silver-haired elder rode forward. Behind him came 2 older women, their dark hair streaked with gray members of the matriarchal council, the ones with the power to decide Takina's fate. Takina stepped out, standing tall. The morning light caught the scars on her sun-darkened skin marks from whips that had not yet fully healed. She no longer stood behind Elias. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. One of the elder women spoke. "Takina, daughter of the tribe, today we ask for the last time. Do you choose to return and face judgment? Or do you choose the path of permanent exile?" Takina took a deep breath. The early wind swept through, tossing her hair into a wild storm. "I will not return," she said clearly. "I choose life. Life on my own terms, not under an unjust sentence." Murmurs rippled through the circle. Some warriors gripped their spears tighter. Others bowed their heads, as if silently accepting what they had heard. The other elder woman gave a slow nod. "From this day forward, your name is struck from the lineage. You are no longer a daughter of the tribe. You will not be buried in ancestral soil. But also, from this day on, the tribe will no longer hunt you." The old chief turned his gaze to Elias, his eyes sharp as blades. You sheltered her. That means her fate is now bound to yours. If she sheds blood because of this choice, that blood is also on your hands. Elias didn't look away. I understand. A moment passed, one that felt as long as a lifetime. Then the elder raised his hand. Onebiwan. The warriors turned their horses and withdrew from the circle. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded did Takina finally exhale. Her broad shoulders trembled, but her eyes were lit with fire. Elias looked at her for a long time, then gave a slow nod. You just chose a new life, he said. Takina answered softly, her voice rough but proud. No, I chose myself. That afternoon, the sky turned pitch black without warning. After weeks of drought, the first drops of rain fell on the dusty roof of the cabin. The scent of wet earth rose thick in the air, as if the whole prairie was letting out a long, weary sigh. Elias stood on the porch, rain soaking through his shirt. He watched the cracked fields slowly soften under the falling water. Takina stepped out behind him, her dark hair wild in the wind. Rain glistened on her muscular arms. The storm came fast. Elias said, his voice rough. Takina said nothing. She stepped down from the porch, tilting her face to the sky. Eyes closed. Rain mixed with dust and dried blood on her skin, washing away everything that was left of her past. Elias watched her for a long moment. She was no longer the abandoned woman he'd found in the desert. Standing before him now was a warrior and a free human being. As the rain began to ease, Elias stepped out into the yard and stood beside her. The two of them stood in silence for a long time, listening to the steady patter of rain. You can leave, Elias said slowly. They won't hunt you anymore. The road south still leads to town. Takina turned to him, her eyes calm but deep. And do you want me to leave? Elias was quiet. Rain rolled down his sun-darkened face. Finally, he shook his head. No, I think this ranch, it's no longer big enough for just one person. A faint smile crossed Takina's lips. The first true smile since the day he'd saved her. That whole afternoon, the two worked side by side clearing the yard, turning over the soil, repairing the fence. Takina carried the heaviest logs. Elias drove the posts. By the time the sun broke through the clouds again, the ranch looked different, stronger, cleaner, filled with the scent of new earth. When night came, Elias lit a fire in the yard. They sat beside it, watching the sparks drift into the dark sky. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel alone. Takina laid her spear on the ground, a silent promise. Elias lit a cigarette and smiled gently. Tomorrow, we build a new horse pen. Takina nodded. The firelight cast her face in a warm glow, strong, but peaceful. In the quiet of the night, the rain had stopped. All that remained was the smell of damp earth and the feeling that something new had begun. Sometimes we don't get to choose where we're born, but we can choose where we stand. And sometimes, choosing to stand beside someone else means daring to stand against the world. In that very moment when two lost souls decide not to walk away, a true home is built not just from wood and nails, but from courage and trust. I've spent years studying frontier stories, the ones that show what people are really made of when everything's on the line. This is one of those stories. Takeaway points, voice-ready perspective lines with examples. Sometimes doing the right thing means choosing someone else's life over your own safety. Elias saw a dying woman in the dust and knew the Apache had told him to stay out of their business, but he couldn't leave her there. He cut her free, threw her on his horse, and rode straight into trouble because he'd seen too much death already. Trust isn't built with words. It's built by showing up when it matters. That first night, Takina woke up in a panic and grabbed a knife. Elias didn't flinch. He just raised his hands and told her the door was open if she wanted to leave. Then he sat on the porch all night, never coming in, never leaving. And that's when she felt its safety. Real strength shows up quietly, in the work you do side by side. Takina didn't make speeches about staying or leaving. She just picked up a bucket the next morning and hauled water. She rebuilt the fence in one afternoon. She cooked without being asked. Elias didn't thank her with words. He just nodded and kept working. That's how respect is earned. Standing up for someone means you carry their consequences too. When the Apache Council surrounded the ranch with 50 riders, the elder told Elias flat out, if Takina sheds blood because of this choice, that blood is on your hands. Elias looked him in the eye and said, I understand. He knew what he was taking on, and he didn't back down. Freedom isn't about running away, it's about choosing where you belong. When the rain finally came and Elias told Takina she could leave, she asked him a different question. Do you want me to leave? He shook his head and said the ranch was no longer big enough for just one person. She smiled for the first time since he'd saved her. She didn't choose escape. She chose home. Thank you all for listening. I truly hope you stay happy and healthy. I love you all. My beloved audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know what you thought of this story. Leave a comment below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales.